All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Reload for Retain webinar. We're really excited to bring you this information and be able to present to you this official release webinar for Reload for Retain. My name is Q Mangus. I'll be your moderator here today. I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Guava. And of course, we're joined by Tay Kratz, the developer of Reload, and he will be the one going through the presentation and showing you this new great product in Reload for Retain. So we'll go ahead and without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. Let me get Tay on the line here. Okay, Tay, are you there?
I am.
Great. I'm going to change your role to presenter, and so now you have control, and I can hear you just great.
Terrific. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your busy day to look at Reload for Retain. I like the first slide because it really captures what Reload for Retain, one of the primary functions of this software is your backups are going to be a whole lot faster with Reload for Retain. So let's go ahead and just jump into this. I want to just give you a quick story here. United Bank is one of our Retain customers, and they have a large and successful implementation of Guava's Retain product. Their internal requirements required that they back up their Retain every 24 hours. Now, the challenge was prior to Reload for Retain, backups were taking about 40 hours to do for one backup cycle, and they had really good hardware, really good backup software, and so forth. So it's not like that was the problem, but this was problematic for them because of the internal backup requirements that weren't being met, and the excessive time, disk, and CPU cycles that were being used to back up the Retain server. Not to mention the impact on the Retain server, which in fact, is trying to dredge data out of their various communication systems every day. So a gentleman that I'm friends with, Willem Bacchus at United Bank, conceived of the architecture for Reload for Retain. He tapped me and said, "Let's make this, and I'll help you." And so it was a tremendous help to have his system, a very large system, to create Reload for Retain. Now with Reload for Retain, their backups are taking about an hour to perform every day, and so that's a really great thing. Okay, so let's go ahead and proceed to the next slide, and let's talk about Reload for Retain. Why? What's the reason for Reload for Retain? One, to speed up backups. Two, it's designed with Retain in mind, and we'll talk about that in a couple slides. Another nice thing is you can replicate your backups to more than one location. There's a saying that I heard yesterday. Apparently, it's used amongst the Marines: 2 is 1 and 1 is none. So the idea of having more than one backup is extremely attractive. I know that it is to United Bank. They back up. They always have 2 backups of several of their critical systems. So let's talk about backing up Retain. What are the considerations that you need to think about? And so can you get all of the Retain data back if you lose your Retain server? So for example, let's say you've got a great backup solution for your database. That's awesome, but the database is just a piece of the puzzle. And if you've got the database but you don't have, for example, the archive files, we often call them blobs, then your database is just going to tell you what should be there and isn't. So it's important that you have all the components. And we talked about, do you have an offsite backup of your Retain system? That's something to consider. Is your current Retain backup solution just too slow? Is your Retain backup solution complete? And can you readily check if your backup solution is complete? What's the method that you have? How would you be able to go and look and say, okay, I've got this file over here on the Retain server. Is it in the backup? And how easy is it to accomplish that? To in a sense, to challenge your backups. Okay, so those are main backup considerations. Really, not just with Retain, but really any kind of a system that you go to back up. A lot of those things are of concern. Now, let's talk about Retain's architecture. Okay, Retain has four components, primarily 3. It has what's called indexes. the database, the archive data, and the miscellaneous files. Okay. Now we'll advance to the next slide. Let's talk about indexes. What are indexes? Well, they're essential for searching. Nothing can be searched and retained without the indexes. You can go into user's mailbox and you can go ahead and look through their items without indexes, but you can't use any of the searching capability, which is obviously a major feature of pardon me, I need to drink water, of retain. Now, good thing is retain indexes are really a byproduct of the database and the archive data, so they can be recreated. It take a while, but they can be recreated. So we wouldn't consider that critical data. It's important data to be backed up, but we wouldn't consider it critical. Now let's get into the critical data. Okay, the retained database. What's the retained database? Well, it's information about the data. Where the data is located, users, etc. And it really ties everything together. Without the database, if you had all the archive files, we call them blobs often. If you had all of those, well, that's nice. But without a database, there's really nothing you can do with those files. So it's absolutely necessary that the database is backed up. And the good thing is for any database platform that you have, there's good solutions, commercial solutions, scripts, ways to back up databases. So that really isn't the why for reload for retain, but you obviously do need to back up your database. Okay. Now let's talk about the archive data. This is really the why for reload for retain. But let's just talk about the architecture. There's lots and lots and lots of retain archive files, blob files, and they're absolutely necessary that those files are available and that they're backed up. Retain has an extremely efficient design in the sense that one, it has single instance storage, and so that's extremely powerful. When it comes to disk space storage, but these blob files that it stores are spread amongst 16.7 million directories, which is actually a good design because it makes retain very much future-proof. You're not going to have, hundreds of thousands of files in one directory, which can be very problematic, for various reasons. Those of you familiar with servers understand that. And so what it does is it knows it has to scale to the billions, and so it spreads its data amongst 16.7 million directories. Okay, so that's a very, very good design, future-proof, well-architected, and very powerful. But it also presents a challenge, okay, because when we go to back up that retain archive data, the old model of backing up data that most backup solutions use is they'll look at a data set. Let's say, for example, the retained data set. Okay, so it looks at the retained data set and it says, oh, okay, all right, I got these 16.7 million plus directories. I'm going to step into each one of those directories, see if there's a new file, yes, no, and I'm going to see if there's a file that isn't new and I've already got it in my backup system. Has it changed? And so that's what backup software does. Now, that can be extremely inefficient for two reasons. One, you have to iterate through 16.7 million directories, and it doesn't matter how fast you are, or how fast your disks are. If you have to iterate through that many things, it's going to take a while. Thus, at United Bank, they were taking 40 hours to do their backups each night. Each 40 hours. So that's one problem. The other thing is that it isn't necessary for the software to look and to see if a file has changed because retain never changes a blob. Once it's written out, it never gets altered, which is a really good design. But again, backup software just approaches data sets in such a manner that it wants to see if there's a change and looks for bit changes and so forth. And that's extremely inefficient. And so that's the old model. Now the new model is well, using reload for retain with an integrated backup system that really understands how retain works. And so the very first time that reload for retain runs, it uses the old method. In other words, it has to scan through all of the directories and pull the data over. I've had customers who that process well, I know, for example, for United Bank, took them about 20 days to get that initial backup. It can be likened to filling an Olympic-sized pool with two hoses, two garden hoses, and that's really what you're faced with is when you have a large implementation of retain. To get that data over that initial time is going to take a long time. But the thing that happens next is the successive backups use the integrated model, or this is the real core of reload for retain, such that it's an incremental backup. And again, the software knows that no archive files have changed, and so it doesn't need to go and look at old archive files. It just needs to look at the new archive files and replicate them. Okay, so let's talk about how that's done. What happens is there's two components. Okay, so this is just a big flyover view of what's going on. But you have what's called the reload for retain agent, and the reload for retain agent creates a manifest of the new archive files via database queries. It discovers what the new archive files are, and then what it does is it replicates those files over to the server. Okay, it's the reload server, and it also replicates the manifest that it created. The manifest is the list of all of the new files that it discovered from the database and then replicated over to the server. Okay, so it sends over those two components, the actual files themselves and a manifest. Now the server then takes and it looks at that manifest that's been sent over, and it validates every single file, not just random ones, but all files that have been sent across, and validates that those files actually got over to the reload server. Okay, so it's a really important thing. And so what happens is if they successfully came over, then the retain server advances the reload server advances what's called a timestamp. Okay, so this is a timestamp between the retain agent and the reload for retain agent and the reload for retain server, or AKA reload server. Okay, so this is a timestamp that they both are kind of constantly working with, and so if he advances the timestamp, then the reload for retain agent goes, okay, great. We've moved past yesterday, and everything replicated over just fine. The server says we can advance the timestamp. Great. And so he then is going to perform another query, and he's going to say, okay, let's say he ran a backup at 7:50 the night before, and now it's 8 p.m. Thursday night. Pardon me, I had to get a drink of water. And so he's going to query the database. This is just kind of in English language, but anyways, he says, hey, retain database, what new archive files do you have between Wednesday, February 17th at 7:50 p.m. and Thursday, February 18th at 8 p.m., like right now when it's running the backup, okay? And so then what's produced, and this is simulated, but I thought I'd show this kind of like in a spreadsheet. It produces a list similar to this, and I just showed you the first 9 lines, but the timestamp, okay, and this helps us to determine where we begin the query, okay, and then the actual blob file. And the blob file, it's really easy to assess where that file is because the design, again, once again, was very, very clever. The actual blob file name has within it the directory set. That's the first 6 characters indicate the directory set. So 8b/cc/a9, okay? And in that directory, we're going to find a file by the name of this.dat. And then that's, becomes our manifest, this listing of these files, okay? And so then we feed this to rsync in a certain manner and so forth, and it replicates the data over to the reload server. Okay, so we call that inside of reload for retain. That's called the standard manifest. Now, there's another manifest that's made with every backup job, and it's called a random check manifest. And so here's how this manifest works: it's a sanity check, and what it does is it randomly selects directories on the retain server's archive data store, okay, where the source data, and just randomly looks through various directories, gets those directory listings of the DAT files on those particular directories, and then it sends that right along with the manifest, the standard manifest, and so forth, and sends it over to the server, and then the server validates every one of those random manifest entries. Okay. Now, so what's good is then we have like this double mechanism. We've got the we're querying every day, okay, but we've also got this mechanism of what if somehow something didn't get replicated across. Again, it's all been validated, but let's say, for example, let's say someone went and whacked some data over on the reload server where the retained data has been replicated to, for example. Okay, so if that were to happen, these random checks over time, maybe not the very first day, but over time, would discover that condition, and then what it would do is it would actually trigger a full backup. So basically, the reload for retain server would communicate to the agent. The agent, when he reaches out every time, he looks to see if the server has asked him to do a full backup. And if he has asked him to do a full backup, then he goes ahead and goes back through that original full backup routine. Now, it won't be as slow as the first time that the full backup runs. Remember, I talked about how United Bank, it took them about 20 days to do that initial full backup. It won't take as long because there's not as much data to replicate, but it still has to iterate through 16.7 million directories and on occasion sending files, and so that still takes a long time because of the iteration. Okay, how long? Well, I'll give you a for instance. I've got a customer that happened to. They were on an Oracle. Their retain system was using an Oracle database. But anyways, the initial happened in 7 days, and the replication took around a day or so for it to re-replicate because it had discovered that there was some conditions where the data wasn't there, and that really wasn't a reflection just of reload for retain. It was a reflection of some problems they had in their retain system. Their NFS mounted to a NAS, and the disk just flat out wouldn't save certain files, and so what was interesting was reload for retain helped them to find a problem in their disk architecture, which then was causing problems in retain. So we've talked about that, the random lists, and so that's a really powerful feature. Now, not only will your reload for retain agent replicate the data to your reload server, but it can replicate it to multiple reload servers. So we've shown here that you can replicate it to 3 other servers. That's in one backup cycle. And in a moment we'll talk about, we'll talk about the job architecture. You could actually technically, not that you ever would want to, but you could technically replicate your data to up to 63 other reload servers. But again, that's overkill. But this graphic is trying to show that this same backup cycle can do a backup, push the data over to multiple reload servers. And the power of that is let's say, for example, you're on MySQL, and what's cool is with that particular platform, there's one added feature where you can take and you can perform a MySQL dump. Or you can have the reload for retain agent perform a MySQL dump and then replicate that over to the reload server so that you have a full-on backup of that retained database. But that same dump, which takes a while to create and perform and so forth, can then be replicated to 3 locations without a dump having to go on 3 separate times. Okay, so that's a really powerful feature of this kind of a design. So let's talk about platform support. Reload for Retain supports Retain on Windows, Retain on Linux, databases, MySQL, Microsoft SQL Server, and Oracle. I noticed that someone asked about does Reload for Retain backup Postgres database. We don't currently have support for Postgres simply because we're trying to get a rock solid product out, and I had to focus on some other things to make sure that was the case, and I didn't get into writing the Postgres driver, and I know that we only have a couple Postgres customers, and I thought, well, I'll wait till we get our first Postgres customer, and then we'll write the driver, which would probably take me about 8 hours. So that's the support, and someone asked a question here too that's relevant to this. They said, is an NFS still required, or can reload be run on a Windows 2012 R2 server? Yeah, so reload for retain, the agent runs on the SUSE Linux platform. Now, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but I guess I'll just talk about that for a moment. Let's see here. I talked about this. Here we go. And why is that? Why is it that it doesn't run on Windows? Well, first off, the good thing is SUSE Linux and Microsoft, they're very well integrated because of the Microsoft and SUSE alliance. And quite frankly, the transport for transporting data is rsync, and rsync is not built into the Windows platform. I've fiddled with it. It's simply not well implemented, and so we didn't even go that route. There's some further advantages to Linux, and so storing it on a Linux server and so forth. And so, but how is Windows supported? Just a persistent NFS mount, and there's no problem using NFS as long as you're reading from an NFS mount from a Windows server. I'd never want to write to an NFS mount on a Linux or Windows server. That's just not a really ideal design. So, okay, let's back up and go back here. Here we go. So what's the design? How do you implement reload for retain? So there's 2 software components, but just one dedicated server needed. So the new server needs to run reload for retain, the reload for retain server, or the reload server. Now, if you already have a reload server, you can use that same reload server. There's no reason to spin up another reload server unless you want to, and of course maybe you'll need to do so because of disk space limitations on the existing reload server. Your choice how you do it. And then there's the reload for retain agent. Now, this can run on the reload server, or it can run on the retain server if your retain server's on Linux, and kind of share that processing load. But whichever design works just fine, and very well tested in both environments. Just and so that's the architecture. Some other features is, again, if you're on MySQL, it's a complete backup solution for those customers in the fact that it backs up the archive, the database, the index, and miscellaneous files from the retain system. So that's really cool. But now, another really great feature is, let's say you're on Oracle, for example, and you make an Oracle data pump of your database. I think I've got the right term. I'm not sure. Or you get a Microsoft SQL database dump, and you put it someplace, that's, say, for example, over on your Microsoft box. Okay, so let's say you have a Windows server and you make a dump. You've made a PowerShell script to do that. Just I went out and I watched a video yesterday, and it looks like it's perfectly feasible. And in fact, the PowerShell script that he wrote, he said it would work on 2012, and it would also work on 2008 R2. And so, anyways, but imagine this power. What you could do is you could then present that data right there on the Windows box, okay? And because of this custom directory replication feature inside of Reload for Retain, you could have an NFS mount over there, for example, and then it would rsync the data, because that's the transport. It would rsync the data over from the NFS mount, persistent NFS mount that it has over to the Microsoft Windows box, and then replicate it over to the Reload server or servers that you're wanting to replicate this data to. So that's a super cool feature that's meant to help people to go, hey, you know what? I want to get all my data offsite, or at least backed up to another server, and gee, why not over to the Reload server? And how can you help me on that? And so this is meant to do that. So you've got to create the script to dump the data, but I will transport the data from a custom directory over to the Reload server. So that's a really powerful feature. And then there's a flexible job architecture versus a profile architecture, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But it gives quite a bit more flexibility to the way your jobs run versus using a job profile. And I think we talk about this on the next slide. Let's just talk about jobs in general inside of Reload for Retain. Okay, you have three types of jobs. You have backup jobs. Okay, that's just kind of your standard. I want to get data over here. But then you have what's called suspend jobs and resume jobs. Okay, so let's talk about the nature of all three of those kinds of jobs. A backup job, let's just imagine this. You make job one, and that replicates the data that you want to replicate to server A at site 1 every day. Okay, so this would be like your daily backup. Okay, and then let's say you've got job 2, and it replicates to Reload server B at site 2, but only on Saturdays. Okay, so quite a bit more data is going to go across, right? Because there's a whole week's worth of data that's got to go across. But nonetheless, you have that architecture that you can leverage. Okay. And then job 3 replicates just the custom directory data from server A to server B. Okay, and then job 4 replicates just the archive files every 8 hours to server A. So you could actually have a job that's just like job 1 might be replicating the a database dump, the index files and the archive files, whereas job 4 could be just doing the archive files. And so quite frankly, job 1 will have a lot less to do every day because job 4 is every 8 hours replicating those archive files. And you could have job 4 run at a greater increment than that if you wanted to, but just so you can kind of understand how that works. Okay, so that's backup jobs, and just you can create. There's up to 21 jobs that you can create inside of Reload for Retain, and so each of those jobs can just again have these different special purposes, and it's extremely flexible, because then you don't create this one profile that you say, well, this is how it's configured. You're creating jobs, and the jobs have different functions and purposes. Extremely powerful. Now, let's talk about suspend and resume jobs. So let's say, for example, and this is extremely relevant to when you get that initial backup that needs to go on in Reload for Retain. We might have a scenario in which you go, hey, you know what? I don't want the backup job to be running while the Retain server is dredging. That's just going to cause too much I/O on the Retain server. Now, just you can run Reload for Retain while a Retain server's job is dredging. There's absolutely no problem doing with that from a technical standpoint. Okay, it's just whether or not your server can handle that. Right? Is of concern in certain environments. environments. Okay, so you might create job 5, and it's a suspend job, and what does it do? It suspends the job, say at 5:30. We'll say suspends any reload for retain job that's running. It suspends it, say, at 5:30, and then we'll say the retain server starts its dredging, and we know that to run from 6 to 7:30, and then we can go ahead and resume at 8 p.m. with a resume job, and that's job 6. Okay, so that's again very flexible job architecture. Okay, so here's some FAQs. Can I back up more than one retain server to the same reload server? Now, most customers don't have more than one retain servers, but we do have a lot of partners out there that might be of interest to them. Well, no. Why? Limitations with Tomcat's rights, which retain uses, is the primary reason. And then, quite frankly, I consider it a security issue if you're putting 2 customers' data on the same server, and so I don't want to enable that. Second, question people ask, why is the reload for retain agent on the SUSE Linux platform? We talked about this. Microsoft has excellent support for SUSE Linux, so getting a persistent NFS mount to a Windows server works great, and so we can get the data just as well. And then we can leverage the strength of the Linux platform, and the tool that's so key here is rsync, which we just is not well implemented on the Windows platform. It doesn't come for free, etc. Okay. Another question: my Windows server is on my retain server is on Windows. How is it backed up? We kind of talked about this. So you just create what's called a persistent NFS mount on the reload server over to the retain server. There's very good documentation that we have in our knowledge base on that. And so then the reload for retain agent then is actually running on the reload server. So unlike in your Linux environment, perhaps you'd put the reload for retain agent on the retain server. Okay. In this scenario, you'd put it on the reload server. Now, just you could do the same thing even if your retain server is on Linux. You could still put the reload for retain agent on the reload server and use this NFS mount architecture. Your choice. And so all that you do is in the reload for retain agent, when you configure it, we'll show you these screens here shortly. The source data is local, and the retain profile location is local, and so that's the slight difference that you're doing there. So that works well. And okay, I'm trying to get okay, here we go. So nope, I'm trying to get to the next slide. Sorry. Okay, there we go. Okay, so that's the final slide. Now what I want to do is I want to show you a little bit more of the technical aspect of how to set this up and so forth. So, but before I do, let's just see if I've got any questions that I should answer. Let me know. And if it's does Windows VM support SUSE Linux? Does Windows VM support SUSE Linux? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I know exactly what that means. I think you're talking about, yeah, so I'm not quite sure what the question is there, so I apologize. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to share my screen, and I'm going to share monitor 2. Okay, I hope you can see that. Oh, I can't guarantee how things look because it monkeyed with my fonts here for a moment, but so the first process that you go through is you install a reload server. Now I already have an existing reload server. If you've never had reload, no problem. You won't see these post office and domain profiles. And if you're just implementing reload for retain, then you'll go over to the configure tab. Now there's no option here for reload for retain because I first have to submit a license. And so what you'll do is you'll upgrade to Reload 5.1 if you already have Reload. If you don't, then just when you download it, you'll be installing Reload 5.1. Okay, and then what you're going to do is you're going to go to License, and you're going to choose your license file that you obtain from Guava, and you're going to click on Submit. Now, remember over on the Configure tab, we didn't have anything about retain. But Magic, after you've submitted that license, it takes a moment for it to restart the daemon, and that's all we're observing here. Here we go. So we go back to the Configure tab, and bada bing, you now have this new panel for reload for retain. Okay, and so it says, okay, where do you want to, when this data gets replicated over by the reload for retain agent, which either runs here on the reload server, okay, or it's running over on the retain server if it's on Linux, it says, where do you want the data to get replicated to? Okay, and it says, hey, that path needs to exist. Well, I happen to know I have a path off of data reload. Okay, so I'm going to save that. It actually tests to see if that exists. If I'd put in an incorrect path, then it would have come back and given me an error, so that's nice. So it tests that, and then I indicate what server it's on. Well, in this scenario, it's just SUSE Linux, and so I say, great, next, okay? And I'm going to just come back over here and show you now that this panel has, you know, various settings that you can change, but we've only set up what's called the server. Okay, so that's implementing the server. That's literally as hard as it is. There's nothing else really to do outside of, you know, tweaking things to the way that you would like them to be tweaked. You know, how many backups do you want to keep and so forth, how many days. Now, just, you know, when it says how many days, that really is relevant to the index data and the base data. The archives are kept forever. So the blobs, the archive blob files, those are kept forever. So it's not like they expire after a certain time. Okay. So now we've set up the server, and the next thing to do is to set up the reload for retain agent. Now you have two options: is you can run it you know, on this machine, okay, on the reload server, or you can run it on the retain server. Now, that's the design that I've done in this current test environment that I'll show you. And so let me show you. I'm going to bring up here. Here we go. This is the server. Now, I'm sorry. This is the reload for retain agent. I just ran a backup job. It backed up 23,000 archive files. Okay, in 10 minutes. Okay, pretty powerful when you think about it. And of course, the true power is that I didn't have to go rifling around in 16.7 million directories looking for those. I knew exactly where they were. And so I completed that backup. Okay, so this is what's called. So basically, what happens is you download software. So there's this RPM. You then put it onto your server, and you just install it. There's very good documentation on how to do that, and so. It takes you through the entire process, explains this to you, and it tells you to download the software, and then it tells you exactly how to configure things. And so let's just walk through that for a moment and give you a little bit of exposure to this. Okay, so you have what's called the default job, which is really cool because once you configure the default job, and let's say you're going to create other jobs, it takes on all other jobs that you create take on the attributes of the default job. Okay, and so a lot of customers, quite frankly, they're just going to configure the default job and be done with it. And they don't have the need to create additional jobs. But you can go in here and you can go to configure jobs and you can create a new job, and it'll say, okay, you have never created one, and so would you want to create job one? And then you can go ahead and proceed and do that. But I just want to go back here and go into configure default job, okay? And so there's different job types. Remember, we have a backup job, a suspend job, and a resume job, okay? But this is a backup job, and it says, okay, where is the local base storage path for retain? There it is. Okay, where are the indexes kept? It's right there. And then the retain archive path. And then here's a really important distinction. You know, a lot of customers have multiple partitions inside of retain. In fact, United Bank, for example, they've got 3 partitions inside of retain. Basically, this is how the partitions work: is you can be archiving to to a certain location. The archive files, or blobs we often call them, are being written to partition, we'll say partition 1, okay? And then at a certain point, that partition, where it is, the drive that's housing it, perhaps gets filled up, and we want to continue using, the archiving features, but we need to use a new disk. And so it's very simple inside of Retain. You go in and you indicate, okay, I've got a new partition, and that new partition now is what we call the active partition, and the other ones are inactive. And so that's a really important part is you want to make sure that when you go and you set up Reload for Retain, that you go in and you account for how many partitions that you have, and that you set up different jobs for each of the partitions, and then you really just have to back up your inactive partitions one time, and then your active partition you need to be regularly backing up, daily, with this incremental architecture that we've been talking about. Okay, so that's the active versus inactive, okay? So you can kind of see how that works. And then this is that custom directory path. Remember how we talked about, if you wanted to replicate custom data, and really it doesn't matter to us what the data is, but we'll use rsync as the transport. So if you feel comfortable with rsync, and I feel very comfortable with rsync, but if you feel comfortable with rsync as a transport for that, then it can transport the data from that custom location that you've made available to over to the reload server. Okay, I'm going to go to next here. Okay, now so that was. Let me just go back here. That was the source location. Okay, so you see that I'm trying to put it in big lights there. Okay, and then here we are talking about the destination location. Okay. So it's saying the reload server is where? Is it a remote server, or is it actually local? In other words, is this running? Is the Reload for Retain agent running on the reload server, or is it running? For example, in this scenario, it's on the Retain server. Okay, so you just have that design and whichever one you want to go with. But we just decided to put the Reload for Retain agent right on the Retain server and have the reload server as a complete different box. Okay, and that's that box that we saw over here. Okay, this is the Reload for Retain server at 10.1.4.10, whereas this box at 10.1.4.70. Okay, all right. So and so he says, all right, what's the IP address? What port do I talk to that server on for SSH sessions and so forth? And that can be changed. A lot of times that's important when you're talking to there are vendors out there that provide Guava Cloud services, even Guava does. And so perhaps they'll give you a different port to go through than 22. And so you can change that for that scenario. And then it says, okay, now on the reload server, where is the reload/retain storage path? And so that's just right here. Okay, reload, retain, backup, storage path, data, reload, retain. And so that's all we're reflecting in that menu pick. Okay, and then it says, okay, which partition number is this? So over on the reload server, it can support up to 20 partitions, and obviously later on we can add more than 20 partitions. It's really not a problem. But this is again this idea of, take for example my lead customer that I created this for. They've got 3 partitions, and so I indicate partition 1, 2, or 3, and basically what that does is it puts it into a slightly different location. And because you probably all have inquiring minds, I'm going to show that to you here. I'm going to look at, let's see here, data, right? Reload, retain, okay, archive data, and I'll just show you here. See, you notice we have archive 1, archive 2, 3, and so forth. And so if I go to archive 1, okay, and I go to archive, all right, there's those directories that you're so familiar with on Retain, okay, all of those directory sets that are created by Retain. So that's what that correlates to, and that's the 1 correlates to that right there. You see that archive 1, right? That correlates to partition number 1. All right. Now, this is another feature here: create, delete additional destination reload server. That comes. Remember that graphic that I showed you, in which it showed the arrows pointing to different reload servers? That's the idea here. Is you can create. You have your primary reload server, and then you can create a reload server 2 and reload server 3. We're not going to do that right now, but just you can do that. Okay. All right. Next. Action settings. Okay, so this is the idea of when this job runs, what's it going to do? It can do a lot of things. You probably want to just keep everything enabled that it's got enabled. Because this particular system's on MySQL, okay, there's an option here, and I turned it off so I could get a backup running here before we started to present, and so I turned off the MySQL database backup dump. But that's a really powerful feature, is it can create a dump file and send that off to the reload server. And so now when you're on the MySQL platform, this is a complete backup solution for you. If you're on Oracle and those others, you probably already have a backup solution. But if you don't, I highly recommend that you consider getting one, because without that, you're not in good shape. Okay, so and what's cool is here too is you can always test your database connectivity. And make sure that all of the settings that you've got are working. So no matter what platform you're using, again, the platforms you've got are MySQL Local, Remote, MS SQL, and Oracle. And first Postgres customer I get, we'll see Postgres in there too. Okay. Now let's get out of there, and let's go to next. And this is where you configure the actual schedule. When is this going to run? But there's some other really cool things. Is you can use the cron system inside of Reload for Retain, or you can do the command to get into this menu, and the commands for everything. It's RIBS. Now you might go, well, what's RIBS? Well, RIBS stands for Retain Integrated Backup System. Okay, and I couldn't use the word reload because that's already been used, and so I just had to come up with a quick command that you can use to get to basically control the software. One, to get into the menu, and then if you're the kind of person that really likes to do stuff at the command prompt, this can be really powerful. So let me just show you here. RIBS job status. Okay. Job status. There we go. Okay, a job's not running. And in fact, I want to do that again. I want to show you also, for those of you who get into programmatic stuff, it gives you an exit code. So if a job was running, it would be an exit code of 1, and if a job was suspended, it would be an exit code of 2. Okay, so I can actually right now do a RIBS job start. Okay, all right. Now what that does is it queues up a job, and so probably at this point, job status. Yep, look at that. A job is running. Okay, and I can even suspend and resume that job. I can even stop it. Okay, so that's a very powerful feature. I just want to go in here and let you see here that a job's running, and here's what it's doing, and we're gonna let that proceed, but you can see that's a very powerful command line prompt. There's also daemon control, so you can say RIBS stop, and that stops the RIBS daemon. Okay, so RIBS start, that restarts it, and I can do a RIBS status, and it tells us that it's running, and tells us which PID it's running on. So very, very helpful from a programmatic standpoint. So what you could do is you could create, remember how I talked about the notion of, and say you wanted a job to run several times throughout the day, you could do that rather easily just using this command in a cron tab entry, So that's a very powerful feature. Okay, I think I've covered all that I should on this initial call. There's more to RIBS, more things to talk about, but I've really talked about the most important things. There's very good documentation, and I continue to flesh this out, but and I tell you how to, for example, support the various platforms. So let's say you're on, Oracle, for example. I tell you how to put in the components that you need in order to provide support for that platform, and then very detailed documentation on implementing. And I even show you this stuff we were just talking about a moment ago. So there you go. I think I've covered everything I need to, but let's come back to questions, okay? So I'm going to go back to in my browser. Okay, I'm going to I think I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. And then I'm going to, okay, great. Now I can see some questions. Okay. Okay, yes, Willem is a smart guy, I agree. He had a very good idea for this. Can you create a VM of SUSE Linux on a Windows Hyper-V host? I would imagine, I'm not sure. That's a very good question, but I personally have never done that. So how much disk space do you need for the backup over time? Very good question. What you need is, the amount of data that's in your retain system plus. Okay, so let's say, for example, you've got one partition. Okay, you're going to need all the data that you have on that partition, and probably the amount of the space that you have on that one partition, but more particularly not just the space used, but all of the space that can be used. You should probably have available on the reload server. You should have available on the reload server, and then additional space. Because there's space needed. Let's say you're doing MySQL dumps, okay? You're going to need space for those dumps. Now, just so that you know this, a MySQL dump, the way I dump it is I dump it and I immediately put it into a zip. While it's actually dumping, it goes into a zip file. So what's really powerful about that is on customer systems where I've implemented this, is it's about a 1-to-10 ratio. So if they had, like, let's say a 10 gig database, the zip file that's written, temporarily wherever you have the agent running, be it on the reload server or the retain server, the zip file is only 1 gig max, and then of course what's stored over on the reload server is 1 gig. Okay. And so that's really cool. So then, it's perfectly feasible to keep, 14 days around of that database, for example, or whatever increment you want, as long as you've allocated enough disk space. Okay. So let's see here. Why not use snapshots for backups? Okay. So that's a different kind of backup technology, and you're right. That's one approach. There's distinct advantages to this approach, and there's distinct advantages to snapshots. A lot of people don't have snapshot options, so I think you'll find this rather compelling. And what I find very often is people will have a VM environment, okay, but then they have the data over on a SAN, okay, and so the data isn't contiguous when they go to, kind of snapping these various elements. They don't really have a contiguous data set to restore from, and so that's a concern with these snapshot kind of solutions. I'm not trying to down other technologies, but I think what you need to do is challenge that technology, do some testing, and see, is it really working for me? So another person says my retain system currently has 600 gigabytes with a full disk space, 900 gigabytes. Yeah. So you're going to need over on the reload server. I would recommend that probably a terabyte would be good for that scenario. Okay. Okay, we're still looking for questions. Really good questions, folks. I really appreciate this. This will help the recording. because these are probably going to be really common questions. Okay, I don't see any other questions currently. Q, I think it's back to you.
Yep, that looks like all the questions that I can see for now.
Okay,
one more that came through.
Yeah, one more question. Will this run on SLUS 12? As best I know, it will. I'll admit I haven't personally tested that. I have tested Reload, the Reload server on SLUS 12. The Reload for Retain Agent I have not tested on SLUS 12. I had a SLUS 12 over at Novell/Micro Focus here that I tested on a couple months ago in conjunction with Reload and got everything working. There were definitely some tweaks to make. I don't anticipate problems with SLUS 12. That's a really good question. Please send me an email, tk@guava.com, if you've got a SLUS 12 box, and I'd be happy for us to work together and just make sure that this works in your environment. I wouldn't be able to test this at Novell because although they have Reload for GroupWise, they don't have Reload for Retain because they don't have Retain yet. So, good question.
Great. And thanks, Tay, for the information, and thanks everyone for being here. Great questions, great participation, and yeah, great product for those needing to backup retain. A couple of things just to take note of, as you can see on the screen. If you do want more information, please feel free to visit us at guava.com, and you'll be able to see information about Reload for Retain. Also, if you're interested in a quote, want to see how much it would cost to implement this solution, you can visit us at guava.com/need a quote. Also, there is a promotion going on through the end of next month, through the end of March. So March 31st, 2016, for new purchases of Reload and Reload for Retain, where you get 20% off. So yes, please visit us at guava.com to learn more information and take advantage of that pricing. And thanks again, everyone, for being here, and thanks, Tay, for the information.
You bet.